You know, when most people think of a night shift, they picture something mundane. A few hours of boredom, maybe some late-night radio or a quiet coffee. The kind of night shift where the only thing keeping you awake is the hum of a vending machine and the occasional car that passes by. That's what I thought when I signed up for this job. But I was wrong. I should have known something was off when they hired me on the spot. No questions about my experience, no second interviews, just a handshake, a room key, and a list of rules. A strange list of rules that I brushed off as nothing more than old superstitions or some joke. But those rules? They aren't jokes. They're a warning that, if ignored, might just cost you your life. I've been working the night shift at the Whispering Pines Motel for a month now, and every night the same thought creeps into my mind. What exactly happens after midnight here? The first time I saw it, I was too tired to care. A guest checked in, just a regular guy with a suitcase and an ordinary face. He handed me his ID, smiled, and went straight to room 13. I barely gave it a second thought, until later, when the phone rang at exactly 2:03 a.m. The voice on the other end was static at first, as if something was blocking the signal. Then, just when I thought the line had cut out, a whisper, a single word, my name. I won't lie. I hung up, but something felt wrong. I stared at the phone, and for the first time that night, I noticed the rules posted right there on the counter. The list of rules I was supposed to follow. No one had warned me about how real they were. Don't look into room 13 after midnight, it said. Never speak to the guests after 2 a.m., and the most chilling one, if the phone rings but no one speaks, hang up immediately. I laughed it off at first. I mean, how could a couple of old rules mean anything? But as the night went on, I started to feel it. The heaviness in the air. The eyes were watching me, and the eerie sound of footsteps, though no one was there. I went to check on room 13. Just a peek, nothing more. But when I reached for the doorknob, I froze. Something inside was wrong. The smell, like mildew and something darker, something that felt ancient, came rushing out. And then I heard it, a low, guttural sound. Almost like something was scratching, trying to get out. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. The rules weren't just for show. They were there to protect you, or maybe to protect something else. From you. As the night dragged on, I realized there was no escape. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were survival tactics. Because once you break one of those rules and let your curiosity take over, you open a better door left closed. By now, you might be wondering why I'm still here. Why haven't I left yet? And to be honest, part of me wonders the same thing. Maybe it's because I can't stop wondering what's behind those rules. Maybe it's because I've already broken one. Maybe more. But whatever the reason, I can't turn back now. The doors are locked. The lights are flickering, and it's almost time for another guest to check in. And you know what? I've learned the hard way. Some doors should never be opened. Tonight, you're going to hear the story of Whispering Pines Motel. The strange rules that govern it. The things that lurk in the dark, and the choices I made that brought me to the edge of something. But more importantly, you're going to hear why no one who works the night shift at Whispering Pines is ever the same when they leave. I had no idea what I was getting into when I accepted this job. The Whispering Pines Motel. It didn't seem like anything special. Just another roadside stop, nestled in a quiet little town somewhere between the city and nowhere. The kind of place that had its heyday decades ago but now just stood as a relic, a place where time had forgotten its purpose. People only came here when they were desperate and couldn't find anything better. And I was desperate. I needed the money. I had been out of work for months. Ever since the small bookstore I'd been working at shut its doors. I didn't ask too many questions when they told me the position was available. I needed to pay rent, and I needed it fast. When the owner, Mr. Delaney, offered me the job without hesitation, I didn't think twice. I remember when I first arrived at the motel. It was a dreary evening, a day that felt like the world was holding its breath. The sun had set behind a thick layer of clouds, leaving the horizon dim and ghostly. The motel's parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few rusted cars and an old van that had seen better days. And the motel looked like something out of a forgotten era, with peeling paint, crooked signs, and a door that creaked in the wind. The kind of place you could pass 100 times and never notice, but something about it felt off. When I stepped inside the lobby for the first time, it felt like I was walking into a different time, like a memory. The air smelled stale, thick with old wood and dust. The reception desk was made of worn, dark oak, which had probably been polished 100 times but still looked dull and tired. Mr. Delaney, the owner, was an older man with sharp features, his face hidden mostly by the shadows of his office. He welcomed me with a cold, disinterested smile, as if I were just another face passing through his life. He didn't seem like the kind of person who would be running a place like this. His eyes, something was unsettling about them. Dark, hollow, like he'd seen too much. But I didn't dwell on it. It was just a job. I needed it. When he handed me the list of rules, I laughed, even though I didn't feel like it. It was a piece of paper with 5 simple, handwritten lines, scrawled hastily in black ink, rules that I figured were just for show. He told me that the motel had been in his family for generations, that it had a history, one I didn't need to worry about. But his words were clipped like he wasn't being entirely honest. I didn't care. I was tired and ready to work. The rules were strange, sure, but I didn't take them seriously. Who would? But as the days went on, the motel began to feel less like a job and more like a prison. It wasn't just the strange rules that made me uncomfortable. It was the guests, the ones that didn't make sense. The first guest I checked in was a man in his late 40s. Nothing unusual about him at first, except the way he looked at me, like he could see straight through me. His name was Mr. Ashford, and he requested a room on the 2nd floor. I gave him the key and moved on, thinking nothing of it. But when I passed by his room later that evening, I could have sworn I saw shadows moving behind the curtains. I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But when I looked again, nothing. It wasn't until the second night that things began to get really strange. Another guest, an older woman this time, checked in. She was quiet, too quiet, and something about her eyes unsettled me. She asked for room 13, and before I could even speak, she smiled, just a thin, tight smile, and walked off without another word. I watched her go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't supposed to be there. Room 13. It was just a room, right? I told myself that. It didn't mean anything, but by the 3rd night, I started to hear things. Whispers, muffled voices in the walls. Faint sounds of footsteps in the hallways when no one was there. And sometimes, when I passed by room 13, I could feel this pressure, like the air was thickening, waiting for something to happen, and then it happened. I walked by that room one night, and the door was slightly cracked open. I was about to pass by when something caught my eye, movement just behind the edge of the doorframe. I froze, my heart pounding, and then I saw it. A hand, pale as death, just barely visible through the crack. I stepped back, my breath caught in my throat. When I returned to check, the door was closed again, as if nothing had happened, but something had changed. I couldn't explain it. The motel, the rules, everything began to feel heavier. Something was pulling at me, drawing me in. I had already heard the stories the other employees would share on the rare occasions they were willing to speak. They talked about the strange guests, those who came and never left, the ones who checked in but never checked out. It wasn't just the guests that were strange. It was the motel itself. The building, it had a presence, a pulse. It made me wonder what had happened here before, what the walls had seen, what the halls had heard. But I didn't know, and part of me was too scared to find out. All I knew was that I was trapped, and the only way out was to follow those rules. The rules were simple, at least on the surface. Nothing complicated. But the longer I worked at the motel, the more I realized how much weight those rules carried. It wasn't just a list. It wasn't just some formality. No, those rules were boundaries. Boundaries that kept whatever lurked in the corners of that place at bay. I didn't understand it at first. I couldn't have. Not until I started noticing things. Not until I saw how dangerous it was to break them. Mr. Delaney, he didn't explain much. He never did. I remember him telling me about the rules, his voice quiet but urgent, as if he were warning me, not just telling me. He said it like it was a simple part of the job, but something in his eyes told me he wasn't being truthful. When I took the job, he handed me a single sheet of paper, almost like it was an afterthought. At the time, I thought it was just a formality, the kind of thing you're given with every new job. But it was more than that. Far more. "These are the rules," he said, handing me the paper. I remember his fingers trembling slightly. His eyes darted around the room to ensure no one was listening. I didn't think much of it then, hell. I didn't even look at the paper. I thought it was just part of the job. But later, when the sun had set and the motel had settled into its usual quiet, I looked at those rules again. The words seemed so normal at first, so unimportant. Rule number 1. Never speak to the guests after 2 a.m. Simple enough, right? It made sense at the time. After all, who wants to be bothered in the middle of the night? I figured it was to keep the peace and ensure guests weren't disturbed. No harm in that. Rule number 2. If the phone rings but no one speaks, hang up immediately. That one seemed odd initially, but I thought it was just an old phone, maybe a glitch. Sometimes, old things get strange. Rule number 3. Don't look into room 13 after midnight. That one should have raised a red flag, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a superstition, something Mr. Delaney believed in. After all, what harm could there be in looking at an empty room? But rule number 4? Rule number 4 made my stomach drop when I read it. If you feel an unnatural cold in the hallway, do not leave the front desk. Close your eyes and wait until it passes. That one was something about it that didn't sit right with me. Why would a cold spot even matter? But then, I'd learned not to question things too much. Not yet. And then there was a final rule. Rule number 5. Never open the back door after midnight. If the bell rings, do not answer it. It seemed like a precaution, I thought. Just a way to keep the guests from wandering out into the dark. But something about the way it was written made me uneasy. Almost like it wasn't just for safety. I ignored those rules at first, at least the ones that didn't seem to make sense. I thought they were old habits, quirky traditions passed down through generations of motel owners. But one by one, they made sense in ways I hadn't imagined. At first, it was small things. The things you might brush off if you didn't know better. I remember the first night I heard the phone ring after 2 a.m. I was sitting there, flipping through an old magazine, when the sound cut through the silence. The phone on the counter, the old rotary one that hadn't worked properly in years, began to ring. I froze. It wasn't supposed to ring after 2 a.m. The rules. I stood there, staring at the phone, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. It just rang and rang. I felt a chill sweep through the room, which seemed to freeze the air. I couldn't move. My hands were shaking, but I still didn't pick it up. Something inside told me not to. And then it stopped, just like that, as if it had never happened. Still shaken. I waited for a few minutes, but when I finally got up to check, nothing was on the line. No static, no voice, just silence. But that's when I knew I had broken one of the rules. And it wasn't long before the consequences started to show. It happened the night after I first heard the phone ring. I thought I'd gotten away with it. I thought nothing would come of it. How could anything come of something as simple as breaking one of the rules, right? After all, it was just a phone ringing. Who would notice? Who would care? But then, the next night, things started to change. It was like the whole motel had shifted slightly, but enough for me to feel it. The air felt thicker, more oppressive. The lights in the lobby flickered now and then, a soft hum emanating from the ceiling fans as they spun lazily overhead. I was starting to feel the weight of those rules pressing down on me. I kept hearing them echo in my mind. Never speak to the guests after 2 a.m. If the phone rings but no one speaks, hang up immediately. And the one that still haunted me: don't look into room 13 after midnight. All of them warning me. I didn't know what it was, but something about that night felt wrong. The usual sounds of the motel, footsteps, the rustling of sheets, the whispers of guests moving through the hallways, were absent. It was quiet, too quiet. And that's when it happened again. It was almost 2 a.m. when the phone rang once more. But this time, I remembered the rule. I had learned my lesson after the first time. My heart raced in my chest, and I reached for the receiver, but something made me hesitate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I thought about the coldness that had swept through the lobby earlier, and wondered if I had made a mistake in even thinking about answering it. I glanced around the lobby. Everything was still. The dim light from the lobby's single hanging bulb cast long shadows on the walls. The old, dusty magazine sat untouched on the table. The clock ticked slowly, every second dragging like it was weighted with dread. The phone rang again, and then something happened that I could not explain. The air in the room was suddenly thick with something else, something cold, something dark. I felt it on my skin, creeping up my arms, and my heart pounded in my ears. I picked up the phone. I said, "Hello?" But there was no answer, only static, the crackling sound of broken signals. For a moment, I thought it was just a bad connection. But then, the voice came through. Now, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was distorted, as if it was coming from somewhere far away. Or maybe from somewhere right next to me. I could barely distinguish the words, but knew the message was clear. "You've broken the first rule." The voice was cold, almost mechanical. It sent a shiver straight to my bones. I should have hung up. I should have followed the rule. But I froze. I couldn't move. The static cleared for a moment, and the whisper returned, now louder, almost impatient. "You've broken the first rule. And now you will pay." My breath hitched, and I nearly dropped the phone in panic. But I stayed frozen, too scared to do anything but listen. Before I could speak, the voice continued. "Do you hear it? Do you hear them?" And in that moment I did. I heard something that had been there all along, but I hadn't noticed it until then. A faint sound, like a distant whisper, echoed through the walls. Soft at first, but growing louder. Voices, muttering incoherently, as if they were speaking just out of reach. I slammed the receiver down, and the sound of the voices disappeared instantly. The quiet returned, but it wasn't the same quiet I had known. It was different. It was as if the silence now weighed like it was pressing down on me from all sides. I stared at the phone, my heart racing. I knew something had changed. The motel felt different. It was no longer just a place of rest for tired travelers. It was something else, something alive. I ran to the front door, but it was locked. The deadbolt wouldn't budge. I panicked and turned to the back door, which was locked, too. The hallway felt longer now, like it stretched endlessly, as the motel had grown in size. And that's when I saw it. There, in the shadows at the end of the hall, was a figure. Tall, thin, dressed in something dark. At first, I thought it was a guest who had gotten up in the middle of the night. But as I looked closer, I realized something horrifying. This figure wasn't moving. It was standing still, staring directly at me. Its face obscured by a hood, but I could feel its gaze, even though I couldn't see its eyes. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my feet glued to the floor. The figure was waiting, and that's when I remembered. Never speak to the guests after 2 a.m. I'd broken the first rule, and now I was paying for it. I couldn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, what I had heard and seen. The figure in the hallway wasn't just some tired guest, but a shadow in the dark. I had felt it, its presence, like something ancient, something predatory, waiting for me to make the wrong move. And I had made the wrong move. I had broken the rule, and now there was no turning back. The air in the motel felt different now, heavier. The walls seemed to close in on me every time I walked through the hallways. The lights flickered more often, and the shadows stretched too far, too long. The hum of the ceiling fan and the creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet all felt wrong, like the motel was alive and it was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was listening, watching every move I made. I had to confront it. I had to know if it was real, if the figure was real. But nothing was there when I returned to the hallway the next night. It was just the same empty corridor, lit by the flickering bulbs. I almost let out a breath of relief. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it had all been a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew better. The dread, the cold, it had settled into my bones. And then, that's when it happened again. The phone rang, just like before, at the same time. But this time, I wasn't going to make the same mistake. I had learned my lesson. I stayed where I was, away from the desk. I told myself not to answer it or break the rules again. But as I stood there, the phone rang again, louder this time. And something inside me snapped. I walked over to the phone, my hand trembling. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I picked it up, but this time there was no static, no whispering voice. Just silence. But that silence, it was worse. It felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me as the air had thickened. And then I heard it, the faintest sound, a low, growling hum, deep and guttural, coming from somewhere in the depths of the building. It echoed through the halls, vibrating the very walls. And then I saw it. I saw him again, the figure, standing at the end of the hallway, just as before. But this time, something was different. His outline was clearer, sharper. I could see the twisted shape of his body, as though his limbs were not meant to bend that way. The air around him seemed to ripple, as though the atmosphere was warping. He wasn't just a shadow anymore. He was real, and he was coming closer. I backed away, stumbling over the floor, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. The figure was getting closer. His shape, unnatural, like something from a nightmare, drew nearer every second. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My heartbeat drowned everything else out, thudding in my ears like a drumbeat. I turned and ran as fast as I could, down the halls, through the lobby, to the back door. But the door wouldn't open. It was locked, just like it had been the other night. The chill in the room, it had returned, and with it, the whispers, those voices, from every corner, from the cracks in the walls, muttering in a language I couldn't understand. It felt like the whole place was alive and feeding off my fear. I don't know how long I was trapped in there. I don't know how much time has passed. But when I finally looked up, the figure stood right before me. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my breath shallow. I could feel his presence. Closer now. So close I could almost feel his fingers on my skin and hear the crackle of his breath in my ear. And then the voice. The same distorted voice I had heard before came from his mouth. But it wasn't. It was something else. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting. "You broke the first rule," it said. "Now you will face the consequences. All who enter here must obey. There is no escape." And that's when I realized this wasn't just about the rules anymore. The rules were just a beginning. Ghosts or spirits didn't just haunt the motel. It was something worse. Something that fed on fear, that twisted reality itself. And I had become its prey. The walls were closing in. I could feel them inching closer, as though they were alive, as though they wanted to crush me. I could barely breathe, the air growing thick with dread. The lights flickered once again, and then the figure stepped forward, his body contorting unnaturally, his limbs bending at impossible angles. His face wasn't a face at all, just a dark, featureless mask. But I could feel its eyes on me, burning into me, and in that moment, I knew that I was no longer just a receptionist at some old, run-down motel. I was part of something much darker, something that would never let me leave. I didn't want to know the truth. I kept telling myself that I was imagining things, that it was all a terrible nightmare. But the feeling grew stronger no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. The walls seemed to pulse with an eerie life of their own, and the shadows seemed to move to watch. I had broken the first rule and was now punished for it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about the rules anymore. There was something much bigger, much older, something deeper than I had ever imagined, something that had been here long before I arrived and would continue long after I left. If I ever left at all, I had to know what I was dealing with. I had to understand what this place was. So I started asking around. At first, I didn't want to speak to the other staff. After everything that had happened, I couldn't bring myself to trust anyone here. But there was one person I had to talk to, the night manager, an old man named Greg who had worked at the motel for as long as anyone could remember. Greg was a strange man, quiet and distant. He had this hollow look in his eyes like he had seen too much and had long ago given up trying to make sense of it. He was the one who had trained me when I started, but we never really spoke much beyond the basics of the job. But now, with everything happening, I knew I had to ask him. I found him sitting in the back office, staring at a stack of old paperwork. When he saw me, he didn't say anything, just nodded and motioned for me to sit down. His office was small, cluttered with old papers, and the air was thick with dust. The faint smell of mildew hung like something long forgotten. I didn't know where to start. I didn't know how to ask him the questions I needed answers to, but I finally found the courage. I asked him, "What's wrong with this place? What's going on here?" For a long time, he didn't respond. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me or didn't care. But then, finally he spoke. He said, "You don't want to know. Trust me, kid. This place, it's not what you think it is. It's never been what you think it is." He went on, his voice low and grave. "Whispering Pines Motel, it's a prison, a trap. And the rules, they're not just rules. They're there for a reason. You break them and invite the things that live here to come for you." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's been this way for as long as I can remember. People come here and they vanish. They get trapped. But the worst part is they never leave." I didn't understand at first. I didn't want to, but then Greg explained. The motel, Whispering Pines, wasn't just a place for weary travelers to rest their heads. It was something else. It was built on land that had been cursed long before the first brick was laid. The motel had been built over an old burial ground where unspeakable things happened centuries ago. Ancient rituals, dark sacrifices, things that had long since been forgotten by most of the world, but not by the spirits that still haunted this land. Greg told me that the spirits, the ones trapped here, weren't just lost souls. They were something worse, something that had been bound to this place through an old pact, one made long ago by the very first owner of the motel. The pact had tied the spirits to the land, binding them to the motel's walls. But there was a catch. Every time someone stayed here, every time someone checked in, they fed the spirits. They gave them more power, more strength. And those who didn't follow the rules, those who broke them, they became part of the motel. Their souls were bound here, too. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave right then and there to get away from this nightmare. But Greg's next word stopped me cold. He said, "It's too late for you. Once you hear the whispers, once you break the rules, there's no going back." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to process what he had just told me. But deep down, I knew it was true. The things I had heard, the things I had seen. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. This place, this motel, was alive, and it was feeding off my fear. Greg told me that the motel had claimed many before me, travelers who had wandered in unsuspecting, seeking shelter for the night. Some left, but most didn't. They were either driven mad, lost to the spirits, or worse. I could feel it then, the weight of everything that had happened here. The countless souls trapped within the walls, their whispers still echoing through the halls, waiting for new victims to feed on. Greg warned me to get out, to leave before it was too late. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave. I was trapped, just like everyone else who had stayed here before me. I wanted to scream, to beg for help, but there was no one to help me. The motel had already claimed me. I had broken the first rule, and now I was part of it. It was too late. I knew at the moment Greg had spoken those words to me. There was no escaping it now. No way out. The motel had already claimed me, just as it had claimed so many others. But I didn't understand the full horror of what that meant. Until that night, I had tried to ignore the whispers, the cold breath that followed me down the hallways, the shadows that seemed to cling to the corners of every room. I had tried to pretend it was just a bad dream, that if I kept working and doing my job, I would survive. But the rules, those damn rules, I had broken them, and now I had to face the consequences. That night, I felt it more than ever. The weight of the place, the suffocating atmosphere that wrapped around me like a noose. The walls seemed to pulse with life, and the lights flickered in and out, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the floor. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something worse, something metallic and rotten. And the whispers, they were louder now, louder than ever before. I could hear them coming from every direction, seeping through the walls and the air I breathed. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't ignore it. I had to know what was happening and what the motel wanted from me. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the basement. I had never gone down there before. Greg had warned me about it and said it was where the worst of the spirits lingered. But I had to go. I had to understand. I had no choice. I couldn't stay in the lobby any longer. Couldn't hide in my room, pretending that everything was normal. The basement was the only place left, the last place the motel would let me go. When I reached the stairs leading down, I could hear something awful coming from the depths. A low, guttural sound, like 100 voices speaking at once, but distorted, warped by time and anger. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the air growing colder with each step. I reached the bottom, and that's when I saw it. The basement was unlike anything I could have imagined. It was massive, larger than the motel itself, and covered in dust, cobwebs, and old remnants of things long forgotten. But what caught my attention, what made my heart stop in my chest, was what was at the center of the room. A massive, dark altar stood in the middle of the room. It was old, ancient, and covered in strange symbols that seemed to move, shifting and twisting as if they were alive. And around it, so many people. No, not people. Not anymore. They were husks, bodies, still breathing, moving, but their eyes were empty, hollow. Their souls had been consumed, left only with the remnants of their fear. And the worst part, I recognized them. I recognized their faces. They were the guests who had checked in before me, the ones who had disappeared, the ones I thought had left. They hadn't left. They were here, trapped, their souls bound to the motel, feeding the darkness that lived here. And then I saw it, the figure, the one I had seen in the hallway, the one that had haunted my every step. But now it was different. It was standing at the altar, its body twisted, its limbs bent in impossible angles. And it was changing, growing. With every breath, it grew larger, more powerful. The shadows around it seemed to stretch and writhe, reaching for me, pulling me closer. It spoke, its voice deep and echoing as if coming from all directions simultaneously. "You should have obeyed. You should have never come here." The words were not just a warning. They were a command that I had no choice but to follow. I ran. I ran as fast as I could. But the basement was endless. The walls seemed to stretch. The stairs never ending. The figure, no. The thing was following me. It was always behind me, its footsteps like thunder, shaking the ground beneath me. The air was thick and suffocating, and I couldn't breathe. I was drowning in it. The whispers were deafening in the walls. They were closing in. I turned a corner, and there it was, an open door, a way out. I had to get through it. I had to escape. But as I reached for the handle, I felt a cold, icy, and dead hand gripping my wrist. I screamed, but no sound came out. The figure was there, its face inches from mine, its cold breath washing over me. And then it spoke again, its voice a low growl. "You will never leave." And that was the moment I understood. The motel, it didn't just trap people. It consumed them. It fed on their fear, their souls. And when it was done, it turned them into one of the husks, one of the things that still walked its halls. And I was next. No matter how fast I ran or how hard I tried to escape, it was always going to be here. In me. In my head. In my soul. I don't know how long I've been here. How many days have passed. I don't know if I'm still alive or if this is just another part of the motel's curse. All I know is that the figure, it's always there. Watching. Waiting. And now, it's my turn to feed the darkness. The rules are clear now, but it's too late for me. Too late to save myself. And now, I'm part of the motel, trapped in its endless cycle of fear. Forever. I don't know how much time has passed. It feels like days, or maybe it's just been minutes. The hours, the seconds, they blur together. And through it all, the motel remains. Silent, watching, waiting. I thought I had escaped. For a moment, I thought I had outrun the darkness. But no matter how fast I ran or how hard I tried to break free, it was always there, always following me. The whispers, the shadows, the thing that had haunted me from the moment I stepped through the door of Whispering Pines Motel. I thought the basement would be the end, that I'd never have to return there. I could escape, but now I know the truth that's worse than anything I could have imagined. I left, or at least, I thought I did. I ran out of the basement, up the stairs, through the hallways. I thought I was free. The door that led outside was right there, just a few feet away. But when I touched the handle, the moment my hand made contact, the entire world seemed to twist. The walls, the floors, the air, it all shifted. The door didn't lead outside anymore. It was another hallway, another room, another nightmare. I was back where I started. I was back in the same place, trapped in the same cycle and nightmare. And then it hit me. Everything had been a lie. There was no way out. Not really. The motel, it wasn't just a building. It wasn't just a place. It was something worse. A labyrinth, a prison, a trap designed to keep me here forever. And that's when I saw it again. The figure. The thing that had been chasing me. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just following me. It was standing in front of me, waiting, watching. It hadn't been trying to catch me. It had been leading me here all along. I tried to scream. I tried to run. But my legs, they wouldn't move. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, caught in the gaze of that thing. Its eyes, dark and empty, locked onto mine, and I felt it. Its power, its hunger. It wanted me. It needed me. It stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. The shadows around it thickened, twisting, curling like tendrils of smoke. The air grew colder, biting, like ice scraping at my skin. And then it spoke, like 1,000 nails dragging across a chalkboard. "You're mine now." I didn't know what to do. There was no escape. There was nowhere left to run. The motel was closing in on me, suffocating me, and I realized with terrifying clarity, this was it. This was the end. But then, just as I thought it was over, I saw something. Something faint. Something out of the corner of my eye. A door. A real door. A door that hadn't been there before. It was small, almost hidden, tucked away in the shadows. But I could see it just barely. And I knew somehow that it was my only chance. I ran toward it. I don't know how. I don't know what gave me the strength to move again. But I ran, pushed through the shadows, and reached for the door. My hand wrapped around the handle, and I felt a cold rush of air like the wind was waiting for me. The door, it was real, but just as I was about to pull it open, just as I thought I was free, there was a sound, like a growl, a low, deep sound came from behind me, and I felt it, the thing. It was right there, right behind me. I could hear its breath and feel its presence pressing into my back. And then, the door slammed shut. I didn't close it. I didn't even touch it. It slammed shut on its own. And when I turned around, I saw it right before me. The figure. The thing. It was smiling. And I realized there's no way out. The motel doesn't just trap you. It breaks you. It feeds on your fear, on your desperation. It makes you believe you can escape, only to rip that hope away at the last moment. I don't know how long I've been here. I don't know if I'm still alive or already gone. But I know one thing. The motel owns me now. But you're still out there. You haven't checked in yet. You haven't felt the shadows closing in. You haven't heard the whispers in the halls. And maybe, just maybe, you're the next one. The next one to break the rules. You're still here, aren't you? I know you've been listening. You've been drawn into this. You can feel it, can't you? The weight of the story, the pull of the motel, like something lurking in the dark corners of your mind. Something that won't let go. Something that whispers to you that you need to know more. You think you're safe. You think that because you're sitting in your cozy chair, listening from your home, you're somehow immune to the curse of Whispering Pines Motel. But let me tell you this. It doesn't matter where you are. The motel doesn't just exist in that place. No. It follows you. It watches you. It knows you. I know what you're thinking. I don't believe in any of this. But that's what I thought, too. I could leave it behind. Walk away. Please turn off the story and go back to my normal life. But the truth is, you can't outrun it. No one can. You think you're just listening to a story, something you can close when you're ready. But every word, every sentence, is a chain that's pulling you closer. The more you listen, the more you're drawn in, the more you understand. The motel, it has its way with people. And when it gets its grip on you, it doesn't let go. But don't worry, you're not alone. Others have listened, too. And soon, you'll understand exactly what I mean. You will begin to notice the signs and whispers in your life. They'll start small. A shadow moving in the corner of your vision. A door that shouldn't be open. A feeling of being watched. You might hear it. A sound? Soft at first. It could be the wind. It could be someone calling your name. But don't turn around. Don't look. Don't open the door. Because once you do, once you let it in, you'll become a part of the story, a part of the cycle, and there's no escape. The motel's reach is far, far greater than you think. So, listen closely. You still have a chance. You can end this before it starts. You can walk away now. Close your screen and forget everything you've heard. You can ignore it and pretend it's just fiction, just a game. But trust me, it's never just a game. You've heard the warnings. You've felt the weight of the curse that follows those who cross Whispering Pines Motel. But don't say I didn't warn you when the whispers start in the middle of the night, when you feel the air grow cold. When you turn the corner and see a door you don't remember ever opening. That's when you'll understand. And if you're brave enough, If you think you can survive the whispers, the shadows, the endless maze that is Whispering Pines Motel, then take this as your invitation. Go ahead, take the first step, but don't think you can come back. Once you're in, it has you. You'll never escape. But I know you. I know you're already thinking about it. You want to know more, don't you? You want to know what's behind that door and what happens when the motel finally claims you. And trust me, that curiosity, it's exactly what it wants. It's exactly what will bring you here, to this place. So, if you dare, if you think you're brave enough, join me. Come back for more. Come back to uncover the truth behind Whispering Pines Motel. It won't let you go. Not now. Not ever. You're already one step closer. You don't know it yet,